Your entire understanding of history is likely built on a foundation of lies. Not small mistakes, but massive, deliberate propaganda campaigns designed to make you think a certain way. From the honorable Spartans to the genius of dictators, you've been sold a story. Today, we're presenting the receipts and exposing 33 of the most audacious historical frauds ever committed. 1. The myth of Spartan honor is one of the most successful PR campaigns for a brutal, slave-owning state with fascist undertones. The Hollywood image of heroic warriors fighting for freedom is a masterpiece of historical distortion. In reality, Sparta was a totalitarian society built on the backs of a massive slave population called the Helots, who they terrorized into submission. Their entire military culture wasn't born from a love of liberty, but from a paranoid fear of a slave uprising. Every Spartan citizen was essentially a full-time soldier and prison guard. Their famous toughness, their brutal training from childhood, it was all designed for one purpose: to maintain an iron grip on a system of oppression. They weren't heroes. They were managers of a giant, terrifying prison camp. 2. The Mona Lisa wasn't considered a world-shattering masterpiece until it was famously stolen from the Louvre in 1911. Before that, it was just another fine painting on a very crowded wall. But when an Italian handyman named Vincenzo Peruggia hid in a closet and walked out with it the next day, he accidentally launched the greatest art marketing campaign in history. The theft became a global media sensation. Newspapers printed her face everywhere. People who had never stepped foot in a museum were suddenly obsessed with the missing Lisa. When the painting was finally recovered 2 years later, it wasn't just a piece of art anymore. It was a celebrity. It returned to the museum as a global icon, famous not just for Da Vinci's skill, but for having been the star of its own international crime drama. 3. Calling tea. A quintessentially British drink is like calling pizza a quintessentially American food. It's technically true now, but it completely ignores the origin story. Tea is Chinese, and the British didn't discover it through refined cultural exchange. They got hooked on it like a national drug addiction. In the 18th century, Britain's demand for Chinese tea was so insatiable it created a massive trade deficit. The Chinese wanted silver, not British goods. So, in a move of stunning immorality, the British East India Company started illegally smuggling opium into China to create a new market and balance the books. The image of a civilized Brit sipping tea is a sanitized version of a history that involves addiction, trade wars, and forcing drugs on an entire nation. 4. The romanticized image of the samurai as honorable, Zen-like warriors following a noble code is largely a fantasy. In reality, they were the armed enforcers of the feudal class, essentially licensed thugs for their lords, the daimyos. Their famous right to cut down commoners who disrespected them wasn't a myth, it was a terrifying reality. While a code of honor, Bushido, did exist, it was often more of a flexible guideline than a strict rule, and it was heavily romanticized long after the samurai class had lost its real power. Forget the noble warrior poet. A more accurate picture is a highly skilled, often brutal, member of an elite military caste whose main job was to keep the peasantry in line and win violent turf wars for their boss. 5. The claim that Benito Mussolini made the trains run on time is the ultimate propaganda lie. A pathetic attempt to credit a brutal dictator with at least one thing. It's the participation trophy of fascist achievements, and even that is a fraud. The truth is, Italy's railway system had already begun major improvements and repairs right after World War I, well before Mussolini and his black shirts marched on Rome. The post-war recovery was already in motion. His regime simply took credit for the work others had started, loudly trumpeting any minor improvements as proof of fascist efficiency. It was a classic case of showing up to a party someone else planned and then claiming you organized the whole thing. Even the one accomplishment people cite, he failed to achieve. 6. The British colonial narrative painted Aboriginal Australians as primitive hunter-gatherers, wandering a wild, untamed land. This was a convenient lie to justify seizing their territory. The reality is mind-blowing. They were practitioners of sophisticated geoengineering. For tens of thousands of years, they cultivated the land on a continental scale using complex systems like fire stick farming, controlled burns to clear undergrowth, promote specific plant growth, and create grazing lands to attract kangaroos for easier hunting. In some regions, they built elaborate, kilometers-long stone weirs and canals to farm eels, creating one of the oldest aquaculture systems on Earth. They weren't just living in nature, they were actively shaping and managing it. The colonists saw wilderness because they were too ignorant to recognize a continent-sized garden. 7. The myth that Adolf Hitler violently seized power in a dramatic coup is a dangerous oversimplification. He wasn't a revolutionary who kicked down the doors of government. He was a politician who was handed the keys. In January 1933, Hitler was legally and constitutionally appointed Chancellor of Germany by President Paul von Hindenburg. Why? Because the country's conservative elites, the powerful industrialists, politicians, and military figures were terrified of a communist takeover. They saw Hitler and his Nazi party as a useful, controllable tool to crush the left. They foolishly believed they could install him, use his popular support to achieve their own goals, and then cast him aside. It was one of the most catastrophic political miscalculations in human history, a backroom deal that handed a madman the levers of power. 8. We picture Leonardo da Vinci as the ultimate lone genius, a solitary figure locked in his studio, inventing the future and painting masterpieces. This image is mostly a romantic myth. Leonardo was the brilliant head of a bustling, productive workshop, much like a modern creative director running an agency. In the Renaissance, this was the standard model. He had a team of apprentices and assistants who would grind pigments, prepare panels, and often paint entire sections of his works, like backgrounds or less critical figures. Many paintings attributed solely to Leonardo likely have the brushstrokes of his talented students on them. He was undoubtedly a singular genius, but his output was the result of collaboration, delegation, and excellent project management, not just solitary inspiration. 9. The image of Thanksgiving, pilgrims and Native Americans sharing a harmonious feast, is one of America's most powerful founding myths, a heartwarming story printed on every schoolchild's brain. But this sanitized fairy tale is a brilliant piece of propaganda that papers over a brutal reality. While a single, brief feast in 1621 likely did happen, it was a temporary truce in what would become a centuries-long story of colonization, broken treaties, disease, and violent displacement. The first Thanksgiving narrative was popularized in the 19th century, particularly by President Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, to promote a story of national unity and divine providence. It was a marketing campaign to create a wholesome origin story, conveniently editing out the genocide that followed. 10. Genghis Khan. The name itself conjures images of a mindless barbarian horde, burning and slaughtering its way across continents. While the slaughtering part is horrifyingly accurate, the mindless part is pure propaganda from the civilizations he crushed. In reality, Khan was a shockingly effective nation-builder and an administrative genius. He united warring nomadic tribes into a disciplined empire with a legal code, the Yasa. He established a Pony Express-style postal system called the Yam that could move messages and goods at incredible speeds. He even created a form of passport, the Paisa, that guaranteed safe passage. He was a promoter of religious tolerance and trade along the Silk Road. He was a brutal conqueror, yes, but he built one of history's most organized and sophisticated empires on the ashes of his enemies. 11. Queen Elizabeth I is famously known as the Virgin Queen, a title that suggests a life of pious, personal sacrifice for her country. But this was no mere personal decision. It was one of the most brilliant, long-running political strategies in history. Her unmarried status was her greatest diplomatic weapon. By constantly dangling the possibility of a royal marriage, she expertly manipulated the kings of Spain and France, playing them against each other for decades without ever committing. Domestically, it prevented a power struggle among her own nobles and ensured no man could claim her throne through marriage. Her virginity was a 45-year masterclass in political maneuvering, turning her personal life into an instrument of state that kept England independent and stable. 12. The colonial myth of Africa as a dark continent filled with people living in huts is a deeply racist and persistent piece of propaganda designed to justify exploitation. It deliberately ignored the existence of vast, wealthy, and sophisticated empires. Take the Empire of Mali in West Africa. In the 14th century, its city of Timbuktu was a global center for trade, culture, and learning. Its University of Sankore housed a library with hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, drawing scholars from across the Islamic world centuries before Oxford or Cambridge reached their peak. The empire's ruler, Mansa Musa, was so fantastically wealthy from gold and salt that his pilgrimage to Mecca literally destabilized the economies of the countries he passed through. This wasn't a land of huts, it was a land of empires. 13. The story of Pearl Harbor is cemented in the American psyche as a completely unforeseen bolt from the blue attack that shocked a peaceful, unsuspecting nation into war. While the attack itself was a tactical surprise, the idea that a conflict was coming was anything but. Tensions between the USA and Japan had been escalating for years. The US had imposed a crippling oil embargo on Japan, essentially backing them into a corner. American intelligence had broken Japanese diplomatic codes and knew an attack was imminent, somewhere in the Pacific. The propaganda masterstroke was framing it as an unprovoked and dastardly attack. This narrative instantly erased any public debate or isolationist sentiment, uniting the entire country behind a declaration of war with a righteous fury. 14. In school, Pythagoras is presented as a brilliant, slightly nerdy mathematician who loved triangles. That's a massive understatement that misses the best part of the story. Pythagoras wasn't just a numbers guy, he was a charismatic mystic who ran a full-blown religious cult. His followers, the Pythagoreans, lived in a secretive commune, swore oaths of loyalty, and believed in the transmigration of souls, that is, reincarnation. They also followed a bizarre set of rules, the most famous of which was a strict prohibition on eating beans, possibly because they believed beans contained the souls of the dead. So, the man who gave us the foundational theorem of geometry was also a guru who built a secret society around math, mysticism, and a deep-seated fear of legumes. 15. The Pilgrims on the Mayflower are portrayed as pioneers seeking religious freedom in the New World. This is a half-truth that twists the meaning of freedom entirely. They weren't fighting for a world where everyone could worship as they pleased. They were religious separatists so extreme and intolerant that they couldn't stand living in England, and then they fled the much more tolerant society of Holland because they feared its liberal culture was corrupting their children. What they sought was the freedom to create their own rigid, theocratic society where only their interpretation of religion was law. They weren't building a pluralistic haven. They were escaping a world they saw as sinful to build a stricter one. 16. Et tu, Brute? The dying words of Julius Caesar, a gut-wrenching acknowledgement of betrayal by his friend Brutus. It's one of the most quoted lines in history. The only problem is, Caesar almost certainly never said it. Those famous last words were penned by William Shakespeare for his play Julius Caesar over 600 years after the actual assassination. It's brilliant drama, but it's not history. According to the Roman historian Suetonius, who wrote about a century and a half after the event, Caesar's contemporaries reported he either said nothing at all, pulling his toga over his head in resignation, or that he muttered in Greek, "Kai su teknon," which translates to, "You too, my child." Not quite as catchy, is it? 17. The idea that Franklin D. Roosevelt and his New Deal single-handedly ended the Great Depression is a cherished piece of American political folklore. The truth is far more explosive. While the New Deal was crucial for providing relief and restoring a sliver of public confidence, acting as a critical life support system, it never fully cured the economic disease. What really ended the Depression wasn't a government program. It was World War II. The staggering demands of global conflict forced American industry into overdrive. Factories that were once silent began churning out planes, tanks, and ships 24/7. Unemployment effectively dropped to zero because everyone was either in a uniform or building something for someone in a uniform. It wasn't social reform that fixed the economy. It was a cataclysmic war that created a level of industrial demand the world had never seen. 18. The image of the kamikaze pilot as a willing, fanatical volunteer dying joyfully for his emperor is one of the most effective and chilling pieces of wartime propaganda. While some were true believers, a huge number of these pilots were not volunteers in any meaningful sense of the word. They were incredibly young, often university students, who were conscripted and subjected to immense psychological pressure. In the collectivist culture of Imperial Japan, refusing such a request would bring unbearable shame upon yourself and your entire family. They were trapped. Their diaries and final letters often reveal not fanatical zeal, but deep love for their families, fear of death, and a sense of resigned duty. They were victims of a desperate military regime that turned its own youth into guided missiles. 19. We're taught that Charles Darwin was a lone genius who discovered evolution. This narrative turns him into a scientific superhero, but it's not quite right. The idea that species change over time had been bubbling around in scientific circles for decades before him. Thinkers like Jean-Baptiste Lamarck and even his own grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, had proposed earlier versions of evolutionary theory. Darwin's true genius, and what made his work so revolutionary, was that he provided a plausible mechanism for how it worked: natural selection. He and Alfred Russel Wallace, who independently came up with the same idea, packaged the theory with so much evidence and logical force that the world could no longer ignore it. Darwin didn't invent the car, but he built the first reliable engine that made it go. 20. The Soviet propaganda machine painted Joseph Stalin as the great helmsman and a military genius who masterfully guided the USSR to victory over Nazism. This is a grotesque lie that papers over a horrifying truth. The Soviet Union won the war in spite of Stalin, not because of him. His catastrophic leadership included purging his most experienced army officers right before the war, ignoring countless warnings of the impending German invasion, and making disastrous tactical decisions that led to the encirclement and death of millions of soldiers. The victory was achieved through the sheer, unimaginable sacrifice of the Soviet people. The nation's vast industrial might moved east of the Urals, and a brutal military doctrine that treated human lives as an endlessly renewable resource to throw at the enemy. 21. Ask anyone to name the world's oldest university, and they'll probably say Oxford or maybe Bologna. It's a classic example of a Eurocentric view of history. But the truth lies in Fez, Morocco. The University of Al-Qarawiyyin, founded in the year 859 by a woman named Fatima al-Fihri, holds the Guinness World Record as the oldest existing, continually operating, and degree-awarding educational institution in the world. It was a thriving center of learning, attracting scholars in science, mathematics, and philosophy. More than 2 centuries before the first signs of teaching even began at Oxford around 1096. The myth of European academic primacy conveniently forgets the rich intellectual history that flourished in the Islamic world while much of Europe was still in the Dark Ages. 22. The French Revolution is sold to us with the heroic slogan, "Liberty, Equality, Fraternity." It's a fantastic tagline for a movement that supposedly brought freedom to the masses. However, it conveniently leaves out the unofficial fourth word: terror. After the initial uprising, the revolution spiraled into a period of extreme paranoia and state-sponsored bloodshed known as the Reign of Terror. The new government declared that a terror was necessary to purge France of its enemies, both real and imagined. The guillotine, nicknamed the National Razor, became the symbol of the era, executing tens of thousands from King Louis XVI to the revolutionary leader Robespierre himself. It was a stark lesson that a quest for utopia can often build its foundations on mountains of corpses. 23. The United States Constitution is rightly hailed as a landmark document, but the idea that America had a monopoly on creating modern, codified constitutions is a myth of national exceptionalism. While the U.S. Constitution was a groundbreaking first, the revolutionary spirit was in the air globally. Just a few years later, on May 3, 1791, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth adopted its own constitution. It was the first modern, codified national constitution in Europe and the second in the world. Tragically, this bold experiment in enlightened governance was crushed when Poland was partitioned by its more powerful neighbors, wiping it off the map for over a century. It's a vital piece of history that shows the fight for liberty wasn't exclusively an American story. 24. The story of Galileo Galilei is often told as a simple fable. The brave scientist versus the ignorant, tyrannical church. He's painted as the ultimate martyr for science, imprisoned and tortured for his belief that the Earth revolves around the sun. This is a dramatic oversimplification. In reality, Galileo was a brilliant but abrasive man who had many powerful supporters within the church. His downfall was as much about politics, arrogance, and insulting the Pope as it was about astronomy. Crucially, when faced with the Inquisition, he was not a martyr. He recanted his claims. His punishment wasn't a dark dungeon. It was house arrest in a series of comfortable villas, where he had servants and continued to work, all while receiving a papal pension. It was a humiliation, not a martyrdom. 25. We're all taught a specific date for the end of the world's greatest empire, 476 AD, the year the last Western Roman emperor was deposed. It's presented as the moment the lights went out on civilization. But this is like saying a global corporation went bankrupt when, in reality, only its struggling American branch office shut down. The Eastern Roman Empire, headquartered in the megacity of Constantinople, didn't get the memo about falling. They just kept on being Roman, speaking Greek, but still Roman, for another 1,000 years. This empire, which historians now call the Byzantine Empire, preserved classical knowledge, codified Roman law, and built architectural marvels like the Hagia Sophia. To say Rome fell in 476 is to ignore a millennium of its history. It was a major downsizing, not a total collapse. 26. The Age of Enlightenment. It sounds so wonderfully progressive, doesn't it? An era of reason, liberty, and brilliant philosophers in powdered wigs writing about the inalienable rights of man. But this intellectual revolution has a horrifying hypocrisy at its core. This same period, the 17th and 18th centuries, was the absolute peak of the brutal, industrial-scale transatlantic slave trade. While thinkers in European salons debated the nature of freedom, European economies were being built on the suffering of millions of enslaved Africans. The very sugar that sweetened their coffee and the tobacco that filled their pipes were produced by the most barbaric system of human bondage ever devised. It's a chilling reminder that you can champion liberty in theory while profiting from slavery in practice. 27. Soviet propaganda successfully sold the world an image of Vladimir Lenin as the beloved leader of the proletariat, swept into power by the will of the people. It's a powerful story, but it conveniently omits the part where the people actually voted, and they voted against him. In November 1917, in the only truly democratic national election of the revolutionary period, Lenin's Bolshevik party got resoundingly beaten, winning less than a quarter of the votes. The Socialist Revolutionary Party were the clear winners. So what did Lenin, this supposed champion of the working class, do? He let the new government meet for a single day, then had his soldiers dissolve it at gunpoint. It was the ultimate sore loser move. If you can't win the election, just cancel democracy. 28. The word barbarian conjures an image of a savage, unwashed brute, hell-bent on destruction. That's a masterpiece of ancient Roman marketing. The word actually comes from the Greeks, who used barbaros to describe anyone who didn't speak Greek because their language sounded like incomprehensible barbar noises. The Romans took this condescending term and weaponized it. A barbarian wasn't necessarily uncivilized. They were simply anyone living outside the borders and control of the Roman Empire. It was a brilliant propaganda label that dehumanized everyone from the sophisticated Persians to the Germanic tribes, making it morally and politically easier to conquer their lands, seize their resources, and impose Roman rule. It was the original us versus them political playbook. 29. The myth of Rome's fall is a dramatic blockbuster. A virtuous, mighty empire suddenly overwhelmed by savage barbarian hordes. The truth is less of a sudden explosion and more of a slow, agonizing decay. Blaming the barbarians for killing the Roman Empire is like blaming a single gust of wind for toppling a tree that has been rotting from the inside for years. For 3 centuries, the Western Empire was hollowing itself out with crippling hyperinflation, endless civil wars with a revolving door of emperors, devastating plagues, and a fatal over-reliance on barbarian mercenaries to defend its borders. By the time the Goths and Vandals made their final pushes, they weren't kicking down the gates of a mighty fortress. They were walking into a condemned building. 30. We've all seen the old footage from 1914. Crowds of young men cheering, smiling, and waving as they march off to World War I. The enduring myth is that an entire generation was filled with a joyful, patriotic fervor to fight for king and country. In reality, this enthusiasm was the product of one of the most potent and deceptive propaganda campaigns in history. Governments on all sides sold the war as a short, glorious adventure against a monstrous, inhuman enemy. Posters and newspapers promised heroism and a return home by Christmas. These men weren't signing up for the industrialized slaughter of trench warfare. They were signing up for the fictional war they were sold. The smiles were for a glorious promise, not the gruesome reality that awaited them. 31. History is often shaped by what is deliberately omitted. A perfect example is the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, one of the largest battles in medieval Europe, where a Polish-Lithuanian alliance decisively crushed the fearsome Teutonic Knights. Here's the inconvenient fact for later Russian historians. Russian regiments from Smolensk fought heroically on the Polish-Lithuanian side against the Germanic Crusaders. This detail completely contradicts the carefully constructed narrative of an eternal, centuries-long struggle between Russia and the West. So, what did the Tsarist and later Soviet history books do with this monumental event? They largely ignored it. For centuries, this epic battle was simply downplayed or erased because the facts didn't fit the propaganda. 32. The official narrative is clean and decisive. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were a terrible but necessary evil to force Japan's surrender and prevent a costly American invasion. This story of the bombs being the single cause of the war's end is a powerful piece of post-war justification. But the history is far more complicated. By August 1945, Japan was already a beaten nation, crippled by a naval blockade and its cities incinerated by conventional firebombing. Many historians argue the true final blow wasn't the atom bomb, but the Soviet Union's sudden declaration of war and invasion of Japanese-held Manchuria. For the Japanese leadership, a terrifying two-front war and a potential communist takeover was the ultimate nightmare. The bombs gave them a face-saving excuse to surrender to the Americans, a fact that conveniently shaped the post-war world. 33. Joan of Arc, the pious teenage shepherdess who led the French army through divine visions. It's a perfect story of faith and miracles, but the historical reality suggests she was less of a gentle saint and more of a deeply convinced, borderline fanatical military mascot with visions that were, to put it mildly, politically convenient. The idea of an illiterate peasant girl leading an army is misleading. She didn't craft battle strategies. She was a charismatic symbol used by French commanders to boost morale at a desperate time. Her divine visions just so happened to perfectly align with the political ambitions of the Dauphin Charles, urging his coronation and the expulsion of the English. Whether she was genuinely divinely inspired or a product of her own intense piety and the political machinations of others, she was the perfect propaganda tool for a flagging war effort. So, history is a crime scene, and we've just pointed out 33 of the most obvious suspects. But we know the conspiracy runs deeper. We've built the case, now you be the jury. What is the one historical lie we didn't mention that absolutely drives you insane? We want the comment section to be the ultimate expose. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you believe the truth is worth fighting for.